Hello and thank you for joining today's event, Bit by Bit, Social Research in the Digital Age, a discussion with author Matt Salganik. Now I would like to introduce Naniette Coleman. Naniette H. Coleman is a PhD candidate in the Sociology Department at the University of California, Berkeley, and UC National Lab Los Alamos Fellow. Her work sits at the intersection of the sociology of culture and organizations and focuses on cybersecurity, surveillance, and privacy in the U.S. context. Specifically, Naniette's research examines how organizations assess risk, make decisions, and respond to data breaches and organizational compliance with state, federal, and international privacy laws. Naniette holds a Master of Public Administration with a specialization in democracy, politics, and institutions from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and both an MA in Economics and a BA in Communication from the University at Buffalo SUNY. A non-traditional student, Naniette's prior professional experience includes local, state, and federal service, as well as work for 2 international organizations and 2 universities. Naniette is also the lead organizer for 6 Howard Mathematica.
Thank you for joining us for this discussion with Matt Salganik. We'll be discussing his book, Bit by Bit, Social Research in the Digital Age, from Princeton University Press. I'll begin by introducing Matt. From there, we'll spend a bit of time discussing how this book came into existence, as I imagine there are a lot of people like me who've not written their first University Press book yet and want to understand the process. After that, Matt will offer a general overview. We'll call it a roadmap to the book via Chapter 1. From there, we'll engage in discussion on each remaining chapter 2 through 7. Matt will discuss what people can expect, what they'll learn, and what might surprise them for each of those chapters, which will be followed by a few questions by me by chapter. If we have time at the end, we'll conclude with a question or two about how Matt's personal path to the professorate unfolded. My role, vis-a-vis Matt, is sort of like an author meets enthusiastic fan with a critical eye. I study privacy and ethics, and I want to be able to see myself and people who look like me in this method as both researcher and as protected and deeply considered research subject. If you've seen our other discussions between the two of us, between Matt and I, including our most recent discussion on 6 at age 5, past, present, and future, and our first discussion where Matt interviewed me, you know that I'm interested in elevating discussions on the topic of diversity in computational social science. Today's discussion will reflect that as well. These questions emerge from joint graduate student, undergraduate student discussions on this book between myself, Amanda Lee, and Amber Dew. Let's begin with Matt's bio. Matt Salganik is professor of sociology at Princeton University and serves as the director of the Center for Information Technology and Policy. He is also affiliated with several of Princeton's interdisciplinary research centers, including the Office of Population Research and the Center for Statistics and Machine Learning. His research interests include social networks and computational social science, and as you know, he is the author of Bit by Bit, Social Research in the Digital Age. Matt's research has been published in journals such as Science, PNAS, Sociological Methodology, and Journal of the American Statistical Association. His papers have won numerous prizes from the Medical Sociology section and the American Sociological Association twice, and the Outstanding Statistical New York Times and the Outstanding Statistical Application Award, the American Statistical Association. He's also had much of his work in popular press as well, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and many other places. I'd also like to point out that Matt is also one of 2 founders of the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science. So let's start by discussing how this book came into existence. Why don't we just jump right in? So Matt, can you tell us a bit about how the idea for Bit by Bit emerged and what your experience was like writing it?
Sure. It actually came about while a colleague and I were waiting for the coffee machine. So that's where all good ideas start, is around the coffee machine. Paul DiMaggio and I were waiting for some coffee, and I was talking a little bit about my class and something else, and he said, "Oh, why don't you write a book about computational social science?" And I said, "Paul, no one would want to read my book." And he said, "No, Matt, I think they would. I think you should try it." And then I said, "Paul, I have no idea how to write a book." And he said, "Yes, you do. You might not know it yet, but you do." And so then he really encouraged me to do it. He introduced me to some people who might be able to help. And that got things on the way. So as I was thinking about writing the book, though, one of the things I wanted to do was I had been teaching a class in what is now called computational social science since 2007 at Princeton. At the time, I called the class web-based social research. And in that class, there were articles that the students could read, but I found that I had to offer a lot of connective tissue around the articles to help people see how they fit together, how they make sense together, how they're illustrating some broader themes. And so one way of thinking about this book is trying to write down all the things that I said in class that were helpful to the students. When students came to me to talk about their research projects, I noticed certain themes came up over and over again. So I thought about what are all the things that I've said to other people that have been helpful, and I'll just write all those down. And so one of the audiences there is clearly more sociologists, or social scientists, who are the people who are taking my class, the graduate students in my department. But I also spend time with data scientists. And so I've done a sabbatical at Microsoft Research. I did a sabbatical at Cornell Tech, the new Cornell campus. And I found that likewise, there are a lot of things that data scientists don't know about social science. And so I would try to tell them certain things. So anything that I've told a data scientist or a social scientist that they found helpful, I tried to get it into the book, which leads to this book that's for data scientists that want to do more social science, data scientists who want to do more social science, and anyone interested in the hybrid of these two fields. And I tried to write it in a way that requires no prerequisites from either side, and that's written at a level of, let's say, the New York Times Magazine.
So can you talk a bit about the process of publishing the book and what you learned and what surprised you about that process?
The process of publishing it. Sure. So I was very lucky to have a fantastic and supportive editor at Princeton University Press. So I started with Eric Schwartz, and then he left and became the lead editor-in-chief at Columbia University Press. And then Megan Levinson took over and helped me finish the book and get it out. I think that it's really important who you work with, and having someone who believes in your vision for the book and can be really supportive in, helping you write the book that you want to write, not trying to write the book that they want you to write. And it's hard to figure out the book that you want to write. And like with Bit by Bit, there was a lot of feedback I got. Some people wanted a book that was more technical. Some people wanted a book that was more, I would say, jargony. That wouldn't be the word that they would use, but like more tightly integrated into sociological debates. But I had to find the vision that I have for the book, which is this kind of more open, welcoming introduction to people with all different kinds of backgrounds, and focus both on what's really exciting about computational social science and also what are some of the risks that we need to keep in mind to do it responsibly.
With that in mind, let's we jump straight into the book. This part of the discussion is meant to offer our listeners a roadmap for this discussion and a roadmap to the book. And I think chapter 1 does a beautiful job of that. So let's start there. So can you talk a little bit about what the book is about, generally the big picture for those of us who are new to this work? What did you set out to do with this book?
Sure. So I wanted to really help people see what this is the most exciting time to be a social scientist, I think. And I wanted people to see that opportunity, but see it in a more general way. I feel like people know about, Twitter or Google search data, or a lot of times there's data set by data set thinking. And I want to try to provide an overarching roadmap and an argument about how it should be structured. So in the first chapter, I talk about 2 themes that run throughout the whole book. One is illustrated with art. I think there is this important difference between the kinds of data sets social scientists are used to and the kinds that data scientists are used to. So the data science approach, I think, is beautifully illustrated by Marcel Duchamp with the urinal. So fountain. And what makes that beautiful and a great piece of art is that Duchamp took something that was created for one purpose, to be a urinal, and he repurposed it into a piece of art. And when that repurposing is done well, it involves a tremendous amount of creativity, and it fundamentally changes what we think art is. And a lot of the work in data science has this similar characteristic. You have data that was created for one purpose, and then you can very creatively repurpose it for something else. And so, for example, Google Flu Trends is a project where Google took search data. They said, hey, if everyone's typing in that they have a stomach ache, maybe that means there's a lot of flu in that area. So they repurposed this data that was created for one purpose for a different purpose. And when it's done really well, it's incredibly creative, but it's also incredibly challenging, as the Google Flu Trends project illustrates, which we'll talk about more in chapter 2. So that's the kind of prototypical data science idea of repurposing. And then for social science, we often work with custom-made data, where we have an idea and then we go out and get the data that we need for that idea. So this is illustrated by, in the book, Michelangelo, who wanted to make David. And so he spent 3 years making David. He didn't look for something that kind of looked like David. He said, I'm going to make David. And so you see these pure styles of the ready-made and the custom-made. And I think increasingly in the future, we're going to see hybrids. So if you're a social scientist used to working with custom-made data, it's going to become increasingly hard to ignore all the ready-made data that exists. If we really care about learning about the world as quickly as possible, we can't just ignore that data, because that data exists and it's real and we can learn from it, and it's hard. And we talk about some of the challenges of learning from ready-made data in chapter 2, but it presents an enormous opportunity. We can either take advantage of that opportunity, or I think we can be left behind. And for data scientists, I think they'll increasingly realize that there aren't a lot of fountains. Sometimes there's a lot of urinals. It's like there's limits to what you can do with repurposing data created for another purpose. And so just as social scientists discovered that creating their own data allows them to learn certain kinds of things, I think we'll increasingly see data scientists creating their own data more, and increasingly hybrids that combine ready-made and custom-made data sources. That's a major theme that runs throughout the book that I lay out in the first chapter with an example that I think is a beautiful example that combines ready-made and custom-made data. And then a second theme is ethics. Is going to be increasingly important for us to consider. Obviously, social scientists have a tradition of thinking about ethics. A lot of that is done in the context of institutional review boards. Data scientists, there's less of a strong ethical tradition, certainly not as unified. But I think increasingly the computational social scientists I see are working very close to ethical problems, and sometimes can do stuff that they probably wish they didn't do in retrospect, because they haven't thought as much about the ethical challenges of working with these new kinds of data. And so I think increasingly in the past, social scientists have been limited largely by what we could do. And I think increasingly we will be limited by what we should do. Like right now, we can observe the behavior of millions of people without their awareness and consent. We being like us, like researchers, that was not possible before, right? That used to be something only governments could do. We can enroll millions of people in experiments without their awareness and consent. Again, that is something that is a new power. So I'm not saying that we should not use these new powers because we can use them for good. But I'm saying we have to wield those powers with a lot of care and responsibility. And I try to lay out ways of thinking about that in chapter 6. But that theme of ethics runs through really each of the chapters. As we're discussing different methods, we talk about the research opportunities and costs and benefits, and then the ethical issues that arise. And so maybe that's a good transition into how the book is structured. So there are 4 chapters about, well, let me just take a step back and say, when I was writing this book, I wanted to write a book that would make sense 10 years from now, 10 years from when it was published. And that seems like an easy thing to a lot of the social scientists. Like, of course your book will make sense in 10 years. But that is not true with a lot of books about technology, because it changes really quickly. And so if I wrote a book about how to do social research with Twitter, like Twitter could be really out of business in 5 years. It certainly will likely be qualitatively quite different. And so what is a timeless kind of approach to organizing these ideas that's not specific to any platform? And I think the timeless idea is one that social scientists have used for a long time, which is the idea of research design. And so a research design, it's not a theoretical question, it's not a statistical technique, it's kind of a recipe for combining questions and answers. So a research design that many people are familiar with is a randomized controlled trial. So there are certain things that questions that you can answer with the randomized controlled trial that are hard to answer using other research designs. And so I think there really are a few core research designs that these have been used 50 years ago, they're used today, I think they'll be used 50 years from now. How we will use them is different. How we will do randomized control experiments in the pre-digital age and in the digital age, I think are different, but the fundamental logic of that design is pretty similar. And so the book is organized around the first design is observing behavior. This is just watching what people do. Most of what people get excited about with big data is just that, watching what people do. But as a sociologist, that's not particularly exciting to me because I know there's a lot of things that you can't learn just by watching what people do. So I know there are other things that we can do to have a more active role in creating the data that allow us to learn different things. So after observing behavior, the next chapter is asking questions. You can learn things by asking people things that you can't learn just by observing them. Then after that, the next stronger design with more researcher involvement is running experiments. You can learn things by running experiments that you can't learn just by talking to people or watching them. And then the fourth design is a mass collaboration. And here, this is one that hasn't been used as much in social science yet, but I think will be used more in the future. So instead of thinking of the people that instead of thinking of yourself as studying people, think of yourself as collaborating with them on the research process. And there have been really great examples of that in other fields like ornithology. So in bird watching, there's an enormous tradition of mass collaboration on research projects, largely because no one researcher can fully observe where all the birds are. And astronomy also has this strong tradition of mass collaboration. And so I write about some of the principles that they follow in other fields and how these might be applicable in social science. Then the chapter after that is about, the sixth chapter is about ethics. And I provide some guidance from how social scientists have thought about ethics traditionally, how some researchers in computer science have thought about ethics, and then how these are kind of nested within some deeper philosophical approaches to ethical thinking. And then chapter 7 is about the future.
Thank you, Matt. Wow, that was an incredible overview of the entire book. That makes my job going forward so much easier because we can concentrate on questions. So thank you so much. So my first question about chapter 1 has to do with the two communities that you're putting in conversation. So social scientists and data science. Data scientists, can you talk a little bit about what their differences, where their differences stem from, and the common mishaps that happen when we are in conversation?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I think it's important for everyone to begin these conversations with a couple of kind of core assumptions. The first is assuming that everyone has something to benefit. Everyone has something to learn and everyone has something to contribute. So I've sometimes seen both of those things not assumed. Like sometimes I think social scientists think they have nothing to contribute, which is completely wrong. There are a lot of data science research projects have kind of glaring holes that a first-year PhD student in sociology would recognize. So social scientists definitely have a lot to contribute. Social scientists also have a lot to learn, because if we want to take advantage of these new data sources, data scientists often have the most training in taking advantage of these data sources. So we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to contribute. I think we should also not judge each community by its worst work. We should judge it by its best work. So I've seen many sociologists say, oh, I just read a stupid paper that uses data from Twitter. And so computational social science is stupid. And then I say, well, I've read a dumb paper that uses surveys. That doesn't mean all papers that use surveys are stupid. And they're like, yeah, right, of course not. There's great papers that use surveys. And I'm like, great. And there's great papers that use Twitter. So throughout the book, I try to highlight work that I think is really exciting and inspirational, because I think that's the best way to approach each field, is to judge it by its best examples and not its worst. So those two ideas I hope will help and permeate through the book. And this also, I think, is a great place to talk about the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science, because one of the things that we try to do there is get these people in contact with each other over in a kind of more relaxed, longer term setting. Interdisciplinary conversations are hard. People have different assumptions, people use different language. And so we found through the Summer Institutes, just putting people together, giving them time and space to get to know each other, giving them common problems to work on where they each can bring a different perspective. All of these things help break down some of the barriers to the kinds of interdisciplinary conversations that need to be happening.
And going back to your comment on ethics, you definitely didn't shy away from it. There are conversations about ethics and references to the final, second to last chapter on ethics throughout the entire book. And I'd love to ask you how you thought about structuring the book when it came to ethics. Was it a hard decision whether that would be just put throughout or putting it in one chapter? How did you sort of decide how to do that?
That was really hard for me. I gotta be honest. I had never written about ethics before. I felt very uncomfortable writing about ethics. If the first drafts of it were basically like quotes from the Belmont Report, just like huge block quotes. And I talked to my editor, Megan, and she said, Matt, everyone can read the Belmont Report if they want. I don't know what you think. And so she really encouraged me to say what I think. And I had some experiences actually talking to philosophers about how they feel comfortable talking about these things. And over time, I guess I felt more comfortable in trying to write some of these things, because I thought it was important to write them from the perspective also of an empirical researcher. A lot of ethical research is not, a lot of research ethics is written by people who specialize in research ethics, which makes sense. But I think as an empirical researcher, you have a kind of different perspective. And so I wanted to try to express that perspective. Then kind of where that chapter on ethics should be, it became increasingly clear to me as I was writing the book that it couldn't just be an isolated thing, because I really think that it's kind of everywhere in all of these other methods. You know, in the very first study that I talk about in the very first chapter, ethics is like a major concern. That particular study, part of the reason that study can't happen more commonly is because there are ethical or privacy issues. To be clear, these researchers did not violate anyone's privacy or do anything wrong ethically, but because of that, the access to that kind of data is very restricted. And so I think it's just kind of a fundamental thing. It comes up a lot in big data stuff where, you know, I think sometimes people think of ethics, especially empirical researchers, think of ethics as a barrier to doing the science they want to do. They're like, oh, if I could just get access to the data, I could learn all this stuff. And I think increasingly I want to make it clear to them there are reasons to be concerned about this data access. And then there are also ways of thinking about it that allow you to do it more responsibly. And so if you want to get access to the data, it pays to really understand what are the ethical concerns, what are the technical concerns about privacy, and how you can address them. Because people have thought about them, and there are ways of, some of these problems are addressable. Some of them are more fundamental that require trade-offs. But I think if you're an empirical researcher not thinking about ethics, you should think about ethics because you don't want to do something you'll regret, but also being more ethically aware and responsible can allow you to do more and different kinds of research.
It's so interesting. You mentioned something I hadn't thought about before we started this discussion, which is, you know, one or two or three people in this space that are thinking about ethics could prevent, dozens of us and even more in the future from having access to data sets. So really, how we operate individually in this space can affect our entire field's ability to sort of gain access to research data and as it pertains to ethics. So really interesting. So one of my industrious undergrads actually went through and did a count of the word ethics in all your chapters. And she said, yeah, I know. And you slowly picked up, it was like ethics, ethics, ethics. And running experiments, creating mass collaboration in our ethics chapter, of course, were the ones where you sort of were most committed to those discussions. And we found so many great examples, which I'm excited to talk through. So why don't we move on to chapter 2? I think you gave us a fantastic overview of chapter 1, and we see sort of where this is all going. And so since you gave us that overview, I can jump into mostly questions.
Sure,
so,
perfect.
So in chapter 2, you talk about 10 common characteristics of big data. So big, always on, non-reactive, incomplete, inaccessible, non-representative, drifting, algorithmically confounded, dirty, and sensitive. I'm wondering how you came to that list, and if in the time since you created this book, if you're seeing additional things that should get added to that book or added to the book, or there's greater depth in some of these sections than you were able to cover in the book.
Yeah, that's a great question. So how did we come up with these? How did I through really trial and error. So I had lots of different papers, and I put them into stacks, like a very physical analog method. And over time, this kind of emerged. I think one thing that did change a lot is initially I thought of these things, I separated these into good and bad. And then over time, people convinced me that it's better to just talk about them as they are. But generally, some of these really raise opportunities, and some create challenges. I think the one thing for people who are not used to working with this kind of data, like social scientists, I think one of the most important things to think about is why was this data created? Mm-hmm. Not just what's in the data, how many columns are there, how many rows are there, whatever. Why was this data created? And then what choices are baked into that? Because depending on why the data was created, there's going to be certain people that might be excluded. There's going to be certain information that might be excluded. It's going to be created in a certain way for a certain purpose. And if you don't understand that purpose, it's going to be difficult for you to reliably learn from that data. So the more you can understand about how it was created, the better. I think there's opportunities created by large. I guess one other thing I want to focus on is the big. Mm-hmm. So often people are very focused on big, and in most cases, I don't see the big as being the most important thing. Sometimes they say, oh, we have this many billion records or transactions or something. And so whenever you see that, I think a good question is, well, could they have done this with 1 million of these transactions? Mm-hmm. And if the answer is yes, then who cares if they have 1 billion? And in fact, often what people do when they have these enormous data sets is they downsample it just for computing. They're like, we have billions of records, but we can't do our computation, so we're going to take a 1 in 100 sample and work with that. So to be clear, big is good for certain things. It's very good for studying subgroups, and that can be very important scientifically. So if you have certain, let's say you want to look for differences in demographic, it can be hard to measure if you don't have a lot of cases, but if you have lots of cases, you can break down much smaller demographic groups or geographic groups that helps you learn things that are harder to learn from just looking at the average. So I think one of the great things that big is good for is moving beyond a simple average to study heterogeneity, which is something that sociologists love, and it's a very important thing to study for everyone. And so I think that's one of the most exciting things about big data to me. I could talk about some of the bad things too. I think
I have a follow-up question on big.
Sure.
So when we're getting big data that we don't have control over the nutritional information that's in it. Yep. how do you think about, or how would you encourage researchers to think about interrogating that data for bias, and thinking about the individual, well, the subgroups that are in there? When we're not the ones that are collecting that, how do we figure that out? How would you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I would think about the why. Why was this data created? And then how does that impact what I see and what I don't see? So if I have data created by the police, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
I would think, okay, what do I know about the police? How do I think, are there certain kinds of things that are more likely to show up in this data? Are there certain kinds of things that are less likely to show up in this data? And if there are, then I need to take that into account as I do my analysis. I can't take that data at face value. That doesn't mean I can't learn from that data. I can learn from it, but understanding how that data is created and what kinds of biases might be in it are a necessary kind of first step to working with the data, I think.
I have a follow-on with my question about how we know what we know about data and observations that are collected in digital spaces. You spent some time in chapter 6 talking about the panopticon and this idea of us being watched. And I study surveillance, so I'm interested in these things. Have we reached a point where we can assume that that people that are being researched in digital spaces are aware of the fact that they are being researched in digital spaces? How do we know what we know about observations in this space, and strip away any bias that may happen from people realizing they're being researched?
Sure. So I think in general, people do not know that they're being researched in online settings. I mean, it's an empirical question,
Mm-hmm.
but I find it implausible to believe that people fully are aware of how like the online ad ecosystem works. Just to give a concrete example, I spent a year as a professor in residence at the New York Times. They are engaged, they run online ads, they're plugged into the online ad ecosystem. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand that system. It was incredibly complicated. So I find it implausible that anyone could really understand, even just that, separate from all the other kinds of surveillance that go on. So I think in general, people are not aware, which is potentially advantageous from a research perspective, because this is the non-reactive part. So people are not necessarily, so sometimes in, let's say, surveys, there's a phenomenon called social desirability bias, which is people tend to answer in a way that makes them look good. In experiments, there's something called experimenter effects, where they think sometimes participants do what they do because they're trying to help the experimenter, or sometimes they're trying to not help the experimenter. So these are examples where social scientists have thought in the past that what people do is impacted by their belief that they're being observed. And so a lot of the passive digital data doesn't have that characteristic. So advantageous from a research perspective, problematic from an ethical perspective, and we have to think about how to strike that balance. I think one last thing I want to add about that. So I've often called this data digital exhaust. Sometimes you hear that term. And Karen Levy, who's a professor at Cornell Information Science, she hates that term. Every time I say that, she reminds me that I don't mean that, because she rightly points out this is all very intentionally collected. Right? It's not an accident that we're being tracked as we move around the web. Like, a lot of work goes into that tracking, and a lot of that surveillance is very complicated and hard to do. It's not the surveillance is not a byproduct, it's a choice. It's a very explicit choice by certain people to do certain kinds of surveillance. So we should not think of this as, sometimes I also call it found data, which she also hates. It is created data. It's just created for a purpose other than the purpose that researchers often have.
So I think that thinking about asking questions is a great transition to chapter 3 on asking questions. So I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I'm really excited about talking to you about this chapter. So in a universe where more entities are able to engage in asking questions of everyday people, either actively or passively. So what are your thoughts on the potential for overuse of computational social science methods? Are we headed to the type of non-response we see now with phone surveys?
Yeah, I think this is a big issue. So just to set the context for the chapter on surveys, it starts out by pointing out the declining response rates. And this is a big problem for people who have used. Survey researchers struggle with this problem, and this problem doesn't seem to be going away. So I think we're kind of getting close to struggling with a certain kind of paradigm of survey research, but I think it's important to remember this is not the only way that we've done surveys. In fact, we are currently kind of moving from the second to the third era of survey research. There was a whole first era of survey research where interviews were done in person and sampling was done based on geographic region, not phone numbers. So the field of survey research has evolved in the past to take advantage of changes in technology to ask people questions in new ways. And so I think that is going to happen again. And it is true that we're going to see a lot more surveys, I think, because people are going to realize that there are things that you can't learn just from the trace data. And there are opportunities to augment the trace data with surveys. I also think, though, this could lead to a good thing, which is that we could see survey researchers trying to design surveys that are actually more enjoyable. So I think a general trend that we see in traditional social science surveys and experiments is that they are not enjoyable. Like surveys are a terrible user experience. And if you've ever been in like a psych lab experiment, it's crazy.
Yes.
Yeah, like that's so strange, right? So I think that's because in general, we're as social scientists used to working with captive populations, somewhat captive. Like if you're in a lab experiment, it is true that you can leave, but like there's a lot of norms against like getting up in the middle and walking out. And same within a survey, there are norms against hanging up if you're talking to someone. And in these more digital first methods of data collection, those norms don't exist. People can easily close the browser, and you're competing for people's attention against all the other things that are happening online. So you're like, your participants are one click away from the skateboarding dog. And so you have to design stuff that is more enjoyable for people. So I think that is an opportunity for survey researchers to take advantage of some of the digital infrastructure and try to reimagine what surveys can be. So I have a project like that with Karen Levy, who I mentioned earlier, about Found Data. So we did a project called where we tried to say, let's try to reimagine surveys for the digital age. And let's look at what are some other information aggregation systems that work well online. So for example, Wikipedia, like what could we learn if we took ideas from how Wikipedia works so well to collect and aggregate information with ideas from survey research? What if we combine those two things together? What would we get? And so we came up with this idea for something that we call wiki surveys. So just like Wikipedia evolves over time based on user input, imagine if you had a survey that evolved over time based on user input. And this would help us resolve one of the main tensions that exists in how we ask people questions. So on the one hand, we have methods like traditional surveys that are very good for aggregating and summarizing information, but they're closed to new information. Like I have to write all the questions and all the answers ahead of time. Focus groups, participant observation, where we can learn new things, but where it's much harder to aggregate and summarize all the information. And so through this kind of hybrid technique, we can try to combine the quantifiability we get from a survey with the openness that we get from an interview. And that's something I talk about more in chapter 3.
So continuing with questions about surveys for chapter 3. So there are all sorts of tools and research methods to enhance, duplicate, or extend the contribution of small groups we have difficulty surveying or finding. These groups are often groups of color. So examples are weighting and post-stratification. So the traditional ways of doing these are doing our work is using small samples. How can computational social science alleviate that or make this better, especially as it pertains to attracting and also studying communities of color, and smaller communities?
I got two answers for this.
Oh,
The
good.
first answer is hopefully it can make data collection much cheaper.
Mhm.
And so if you can increase your sample size by a factor of 100, then you're naturally going to get more of every group of people. And so then you'll be able to study those subgroups as part of a larger sample. And so a lot of these digital techniques are not always based on improvements in accuracy. Sometimes they're based on improvements in cost. This comes up a lot in surveys. If you can cut the cost per complete by a factor of 100, you can collect 100 times more data, which is really good. So that's one, is lowering the cost to get more data of all kinds. A second thing that you could do, I just saw a talk about this actually yesterday, 2 days ago, using Facebook ads to target different groups for recruitment into surveys. So here's a place where the surveillance capitalism can really help researchers. So Facebook has very detailed information about lots of people, and they make it very easy for anyone to target a stimuli to any subgroup of people you want. So if you want African Americans 18 to 29 living in Nebraska, like there are probably thousands of them on Facebook, and you just put an ad on Facebook and you can reach them. And so you can target very specific groups very precisely and recruit them into surveys that way. So I think that is an example of some way that we can take advantage of a lot of the infrastructure that's been built already. And I think that also highlights a general theme in the book that the biggest opportunities for researchers will arise, I think, when the goals of the researchers, when the research can kind of piggyback off of infrastructure that's created by companies for other purposes. So Facebook did not create the ability to do micro-targeting to help either of us do our survey research. They created that infrastructure for ads, and it just so happens that infrastructure is really useful for us too. And I think we can bet over the next 5 to 10 years that we'll continue to see improvements in the ability to do micro-targeting of advertisements. I don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future of technology, but I'm pretty confident that the ability to target ads will continue to improve.
That ruined my final question for chapter 7. What's going to happen in the future, Matt? So
well, that is one thing. That is one thing. I think increasing surveillance, increasing ability to target ads, but there's some other things too. So we'll come back to that later.
To the chapter 7. So I have a gamification question for you, and then I'd also like to talk about a dissertation that you bring up in this chapter also. And I want to make sure I'm pronouncing Naomi's last name properly. Is it Shugi?
Sugi.
Sugi. Right, so I have some questions about Naomi's dissertation, which I'm excited to talk to you about. But before that, can we talk a little bit about gamification? So I'm wondering how researchers should think about drawing the line between research and something else. And I don't know what the something else is. If it's games, if it's fun, how do you figure out that line? And also, as you think about that, should you also be thinking about how whether or not gamification might erode trust in research or institutions or something like that? So I know this goes into the surveillance capitalism space too, but how do we think about making research fun for participants, but without setting up a situation where they start to get suspicious of research?
Yeah, I think, well, I can tell you how I've thought about it in the past, is to really try to embrace, not draw a line, but embrace the mixing. So for example, I tried to do a project where I created a video game, and I was going to try to vary the incentive points that people get to study cooperation and defection in a kind of, about like Prisoner's Dilemma lab experiments.
Yeah.
This could very naturally be a video game. I mean, actually it turned out to be much harder than I thought, but the tension between cooperation and competition feels like a core social science question, feels like the basis of an interesting video game, and we struggled. So I think that embracing the fun is, I think, less likely to lead to an erosion in trust if there's transparency about what's happening.
Mhm.
So I think the bigger risk in trust is a lack of transparency. And I think that can come in from a lot of other methods. But one great thing about surveys is it's pretty clear what's happening, right? You're saying, hey, I'm a researcher, I'm asking you these questions. Will you tell me? And you can say no if you want. And I think surveys in that way, they have a high amount of transparency about what's happening to the participants.
I would love to get to a point where I can say my research includes video games. That sounds like that was probably quite the endeavor to attempt to do that. Can we talk a
I
little
just
bit
want to point
about?
out one thing about that, though, is that we don't often talk about our projects that don't succeed. There's tons of projects that don't succeed. Like I spent a long time on that and it died. And so I think that's especially common in computational social science. Whenever you're working in a new area, there's stuff you just don't know, and stuff you think it's going to work one way doesn't work out. I've seen a lot of projects fail, and that's just a normal part of working in a new area. So I hope, for people watching this, if you've had projects fail, that's welcome to the club. And hopefully you can learn from that. Hopefully you can fail faster. Hopefully you haven't wasted a huge amount of time, but it's part of the process of working in a new area.
And the moving fast and things is something that I think is a fun addition to the social sciences. Moderated with thoughtfulness.
Yes.
Thinking about the people that we're working with. But that again, you preempted one of my questions from Matt. It's like you've read my questions, which you have not.
I have not.
You have
We're
not.
in sync, though. We're in sync.
I know, this is great. Okay, so I'd like to ask you a little bit about Naomi Sugi's dissertation project. Could you give us a little bit of background on it?
Sure, absolutely. So
yeah.
Naomi was a grad student at Princeton, and her dissertation was about prisoner reentry. Mm-hmm. So after people have been in prison, they get out. And in fact, lots of people get out of prison every day. And I think there's a concern that we're not really setting up a lot of these people for success, mm-hmm. or there are a lot of actual barriers to people having a successful reentry, even after they've done the time that the court system has given to them. So she was very interested in what can we do to make prisoner reentry more successful. And in fact, lots of people want prisoner reentry to be successful. The people who are leaving the prison, the wider community, politicians, everybody wants success here, but there's still more barriers than there should be. And so one of the challenges in this research is that it's a very unstable time, right, as people are getting let out. There's a lot of changes happening very quickly. Mm-hmm. Normal survey methods survey people, let's say, every 6 months, every year, and that's just not going to work in this setting. So she needed to be able to survey people like every day and track over time things like their well-being. Also, their search for work was a major component of her work, because there are a number of barriers to employment. And so through these kind of rapid smartphone surveys, she was trying to study this process better. She also had built into it an experiment where she tried to help people get jobs. Some of the people she did not provide that same assistance to try to test out this program. And one of the things I love about her work is, well, one, she's working on a real problem. And the way she built ethics into the design of her study, she was very thoughtful about what kind of data she would even store herself, right? Because this is, as a researcher, like, we want all the data. That's kind of our first reaction.
That's our thing.
Yeah. But in this domain, like, you have to be careful about what you store. She got a certificate from NIH, I believe, to
a certificate of confidentiality.
Certificate of confidentiality to make sure that her records couldn't be subpoenaed. Everything was encrypted on the phone. Everything was encrypted in transit, and so on. And also, she was personally there providing a lot of the training to the people when she gave them the phones. So she gave them the phones and taught them how to, here's what I'm going to be asking you. And so she really was working closely with this population, and you could tell that she cared a lot about treating these people with respect as a part of this research, as partners in the project.
We spent, I think I mentioned this to you, but for 7 Saturdays, every month for 7 months, we've been reading this book as a group, and we spent a whole lot of time talking about Naomi's dissertation. Was this a dissertation? Was this an article? I'm trying to remember.
It was both. So it was a
It was
dissertation,
both.
and I talked some about the articles. There was some of the research was published from her dissertation was published in the American Journal of Sociology. Some was published in Sociological Methods and Research. Those are both, the Sociological Methods and Research was a lot about how we can use smartphones. I guess the other thing to add to this is the smartphones, there's also geographic information that can be collected, which
I believe she gave people the ability to turn off on the phones, I believe. Yes.
Yes. So that creates a lot of opportunities for researchers and a lot of potential complications. She thought through all of those. So yeah, I think it's great work. She's a professor now at UC Irvine, so you should invite her down to have a talk.
Very happy to have her in the UC system. So what I loved about what you presented on her work is just the background on how she made sure she received meaningful informed consent. She taught them and made sure they were able to shut off the geographical features on the phones. She got a certificate of confidentiality that meant she couldn't be forced to turn over the data. We were wondering about the technical knowledge and what role either computer scientists or sort of fed into this work that she did, or if that was her background, because for the average, I'm assuming, social scientist and sociologist, the type of technical knowledge and privacy protection that would have to be built into this is quite immense. And I was wondering if you had any background on that. That was one of the questions. And then I have a tougher question about that doesn't necessarily connect to her paper, but is a larger piece of feedback that I've received when I tell people that this is a method that I'm using, that because we are so far ahead of regulation and the law, that we have the potential to exploit spaces where there are no standards, and how do we think about those decisions as researchers and make sure that in the same way that Naomi did in getting the certificate of confidentiality and making sure that the people that she's working with had the ability to shut that off, how do we make sure that we go to that level of thoughtfulness? Because with a sample, in her case, of only 131 people, and with the where we've reached a point where we can't guarantee anonymity with our research anymore, how do we make sure we're all as thoughtful as she is, or she was in this study?
Yeah. So there's, I guess, how did she do it both technically and then in terms of her level of care?
Yeah.
So the technical question is, she worked with an undergraduate computer science student. So a lot of the infrastructure to do these kinds of studies is getting easier and easier. So if someone tried to do this right now, it'd be much easier than it was when Naomi was doing it. Also, all of her code was open source, so people could pick that up and work from that. I think that, in fact, I would argue that for other people doing this, the best thing might be not to try to create something yourself. So in fact, I remember talking to Naomi about all the other apps that already exist, because the idea of location tracking and surveying app, like some of that functionality already exists in other things. So rather than building it yourself, maybe you could take something that already exists. There are a number of reasons why that didn't make sense in this case. But my first encouragement to people is always look for something that already exists rather than try to make it yourself, at least initially. Now, how can we all be as thoughtful? That's hard, but Naomi is a person. She's a very smart person, but she cared. She thought about it. I think it arises in part from her domain expertise. She's spent a lot of time thinking about this part of the criminal justice system. And it also comes from being a part of a community. So at Princeton, we have a center called the Center for Information Technology Policy. There are many computer scientists and social scientists there interested in privacy and
I believe you are the executive director of that center, are you
I
not?
am, yes, I am. It's a great place. So, she talked to people and thought about it and read some
Yeah.
stuff. And so, if you think of all of the stuff that graduate students do, this is not any harder than reading Weber. It's just like,
yeah.
if you can
Yeah.
read Weber, you can do this. It just comes from our community talking about it more, because I think a lot of people are struggling to make these decisions on their own and not getting the benefit of learning from what other people have done. And so that is another thing that I think was very important about the paper she published, which is she wrote down all the stuff she thought about and how she thought about it. So the next person doesn't have to start where she started. That next person can build on what Naomi has done and do something even better. And I know Naomi would be delighted if people figured out a safer way to do it. That would be really exciting to her.
Do you think she'd come and speak at 6 Howard Mathematica this summer? You put in a good word for us?
I can absolutely put in a good word for you.
Although
I don't think that would be necessary. I think she would love to.
I also think you should put, if you can read Weber, you can do this on the t-shirt this summer. that should be our new tagline. Thank you. So jump into chapter 4 on running experiments. So there obviously chapter on running experiments, but there's a whole lot in there too about thinking about, I'm trying to recall exactly the way you described it, but relationships with the powerful as you conceptualize, ways to do things. It helps if someone is already doing it and has thought through some of these things, right? So how do you conceptualize relationship with the powerful that allows all or most research to see the light of day? Because you mentioned in the chapter that sometimes if those incentives aren't lined up, you can spend a lot of time on, I'm not saying the video game, but you can spend a lot of time on something, and then a relationship with the powerful might lead to that not being able to be published or put out into the public sphere. So how do we think about that relationship and those conversations that allow our research to flourish?
Yeah, it's a very tricky question. So just to provide some context, if you want to do an experiment, a randomized controlled trial, this involves recruiting people, delivering a treatment, and measuring the outcome, and randomizing. So those 4 things: recruitment, randomization, treatment, and outcome. And a lot of people are already doing a lot of those things. So to take an example that, Facebook has a lot of people. They're already doing a lot of randomization. They're already doing a lot of experiments. They're collecting tons of outcomes. And so one approach to doing experiments would be to try to partner with Facebook to do an experiment about, let's say, the spread of information in networks or something like that. And if you could convince them to do it, that would be something that you could never do on your own. They scale with a level of precision that no individual researcher can do. The challenge is they might not want to do what you want to do for a variety of reasons. And even if they do, someone wants to do it, someone else may not want to do it. The person that wants to do it might leave the company. There's all these risks involved in partnering with companies. So how do you balance that? To be honest, I don't know. I have generally avoided doing that strategy. In the experiments chapter, I also talk about my dissertation research, which is where we built a music downloading website so that we could control it and do whatever we wanted ourselves. Music Lab, yeah. So yes. I have generally not adopted the strategy of partnering with the powerful because I see a lot of risks there. I also see opportunities. And so for people interested in that, I would recommend the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science. We have something called the Six Festival. And this is the same event where Naniette and I interviewed Naniette. And it's also, there was a panel by some of our alums who have done a lot of work partnering with companies, and they talk about some of the different strategies that they use. Dave Holtz and Sanaz talk a little bit about their experiences. They have some good recommendations. It can be tricky, but it can allow you to do stuff that would be hard to do or impossible to do otherwise.
I'm going to go take a look at that video. I'm also wondering if you have thoughts on things that either universities or organizations that represent us all sort of at large, like AAAS, can do to level the playing field or help researchers to negotiate for research value, not just sort of the financial value. It's one of those big should questions that I think as academics we're told not to answer, but I'll throw it out there anyway.
Yeah, it's a really hard one. I
Yeah.
do think there are opportunities for these kind of collective action, like things in the area of data access, like in the big data space. So for example, the Social Science Research Council and Facebook and Social Science One have started this system where researchers can apply to get access to data from Facebook. And then there's a very complicated set of procedures. And then eventually they can get access to certain kinds of data, and they can publish the results of that research without going through Facebook clearance. So I think that kind of structure is very good. That particular one turned out to be much more complicated than everyone realized. And I think people are learning from that and trying in other ways. I think the ability to deploy experiments into live systems will be very hard to kind of collectivize in the same way as access to existing data.
Great follow-on. Well, I just said my question was great. I have a great question for you. So the idea that you could study, 4 million people at one time, I find that both very exciting and also ethically very scary. So how do we think about, or how do you think about the point at which, I guess where would the bar be for you, or how would you think about a moment where a research study could include everyone on the planet? What's the bar for you, and how should researchers think about?
Sure. I think in the past, I think researchers have tried a lot to make their experiments bigger. And I think going forward, we should really think more about how we can make our experiments smaller. And here I was really inspired by research in animal research. So I have a friend who's a biology professor, and I was talking to her about this. And she's like, oh yeah, we don't want big studies. We want our studies to be as small as possible because we don't want to harm these animals unless we really have to. So like if you think about, an experiment with kittens, let's say, you really don't want to do an experiment with kittens, but under certain conditions, you might do it. So I think they have like the 3 R's. It's developed in that community by Russell and Birch in 1959, humane experimental techniques. So the 3 R's are replace, refine, and reduce. So replace experiments with less invasive techniques if possible. Refine is make the treatments as least harmful as possible. And then reduce is reduce the number of people in your experiment to be no more than what you need. And so I think those 3 R's provide some good things to think about as you decide on design a research study. And then in Bit by Bit, I give an example of a real social science experiment that was done on Facebook, and use those 3 R's to talk about how they could have done that experiment in a slightly different way.
So, and I'm thinking that was the power analysis you noted in that chapter. Do you see a value in the creation of, or is there a way baked into computational social science that considers or creates an analysis of potential harm? Also, are we at a point, or how might we inject when we're looking at and I love animals, but when we're looking at people too, how do you make sure that we live up to do no harm? I'm thinking about the emotional contagion experiment.
Yep. Yep. That is the one that I use to talk about the 3 Rs. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, a lot of times we don't know the risks of the treatments that we're giving. So in the ethics chapter, I talk more about how we can deal with that. So one example would be staged trials. So this is just copying straight what they do in drug trials, right? So they don't jump to a large RCT in stage 1. That's stage 3 of a clinical trial. Stage 1 is finding a healthy dose. Stage 2 is trying it in a small population to see if it can work at all. And then stage 3 is going to the full RCT that we often think of for drug trials. So right there, you could imagine doing something like doing smaller versions to try to understand whether it's a safe dose and whether there is a chance that the treatment could be effective at all before you do a big trial. Another thing, again, straight out of clinical trials, is tracking harms that happen. So if you think that, you may think, like, emotional contagion is a great example. Was anyone actually harmed by that? Like, I don't really know. I mean, maybe, maybe not. Some people really think people were harmed. Other people really don't. You could imagine trying to track what kinds of harm is happening as you're doing your work. Obviously, you don't expect harm to happen, but you never know. And so if there's a substantial amount of unexpected harm, then you would stop doing your study.
And also having a plan in place to know how you would respond to that. So,
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about the prison experiment at Stanford, and they just shut it down. There was no, well, what can we do? If it had just reached a level where it just needed to be stopped. So I think how researchers think about potential harm and the ways that they can alleviate that if it happens, I think is quite important. Since I'm looking at the time and realize how close we're getting to the end, I'm going to give you a twofer that covers chapter 4 and chapter 5.
Okay.
So it connects with remember your crowd. The fact that the work that you're doing has to do with people, and then also connecting that with the idea of zero variable cost. So in both situations, we're thinking about how can I describe this? You're thinking that there's a large group of people involved, right? So either it's your experiment, or in the case of mass collaboration, the large crowd is probably your fellow authors. So my question is, how do we think about currency? So with regards to your other potential people who are researching with you, how do we think about what they consider valuable as computational social scientists? So for one person, that might be having their name on a paper. For someone else, that might actually just be money. And the same is true with moving towards zero cost with research. So how do we think about compensating those that are involved in this work, especially when you think about how many communities, especially communities of color, are engaged in this work? So how do we think about currency and payment and such in those two spaces?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So traditionally, social scientists have paid people for their time. That doesn't scale very well, to use a term from Silicon Valley. So if you want to have 1 million people in your study, you can't really be paying them all.
I don't have $1 million, Matt.
Yeah. So how do we do that? So I think it's a challenge. So I think one way is we can be transparent. So in the mass collaboration I did, the Fragile Families Challenge, we said to people, there will be opportunities to publish papers together. There will be opportunities for you to publish papers individually in a special issue of a journal we're creating. There will be prizes. Those prizes will involve a trip to Princeton, New Jersey to talk about your research, which is attractive to some people, but not attractive to other people.
It's quite attractive to me.
Well, so I think if you're clear about what is available, and then people who want to do that kind of work for money, they know that this is not really a good project for me. So I think, first of all, thinking about it, we thought a lot in our research about the Fragile Families Challenge, how to honor the contribution that people make and being clear with people and letting them decide. I think there is a risk of possibly some people trying to exploit other people. But I think if things are clear and if the organizer of the mass collaboration treats those people as colleagues and not participants, think just the way you treat a colleague. I mean, like in some ways it's complicated, but in some ways, like
it's quite simple too.
How like how do you treat people? Like, yeah, I think about how you treat a colleague. That was our guiding idea with the Fragile Families Challenge. These are our colleagues. We're working together on this project.
So also in chapter 5, I'm thinking about, and I can't remember if this is the chapter we talked about the Belmont report, where I imagine there were large chunks of text at one point, or and then the newer report that takes into account things that happen in digital spaces. And I'm wondering if you think that what we have right now is adequate in the protection of human subjects in this work, or if you think we're on the precipice in sort of era 4 of thinking about these things more deeply.
Yeah, this is something I talked about a lot in the ethics chapter, and I do not think that our current frameworks are designed for the digital age. They were really designed for a very different kind of study. They grew out of a lot of failures of medical ethics that happened before the year 2000. I mean, the most horrific example is the Tuskegee study, which, as my colleague Ruha Benjamin points out, should be called the US Public Health Study, because those are the people who are actually doing the study. That kind of, some of the same horrors of what happened there can happen again, but there's a lot of different kinds of problems that can arise now. So I think, you know, the ideas that were in the Belmont report make sense still, but have to be modernized. But in some ways, I don't think the answer is more rules, because I think the technology is changing so quickly that it's going to be hard for the rules to catch up. I think for us to try to come up with some principles that we can follow, and even some more general ethical frameworks that can help us reason about how to respond in cases where the rules aren't set. So you mentioned this in your earlier question. In cases where the rules aren't set, are we exploiting people or taking advantage of this gap? And I would say we could, but we also have the opportunity to set standards. Like, that is to say, this is what we think is necessary to do an online experiment, or this is what we think is necessary to work with passively collected data without informed consent. And as researchers, I think we have an opportunity to help set standards and clarify what's happening, and make, you know, try to create a race to the top.
And I appreciated greatly in chapter 6, your ethics chapter, where we'll spend some time in our last few minutes, that you leaned into who we are as researchers, that there's the assumption of well-meaning and educated individuals who are trying to do good and not do harm here. And I think the question of how we ensure that sort of non-well-meaning people who are potentially trying to do bad things, that's outside of our conversation. But I think when people think about things that scare them, they're not considering researchers like us that are trying to do good here. So let's go to a sort of a specific question. I wonder how Karen Levy would feel about the way that I'm going to word this, because it's kind of found data. So what conversations are happening surrounding the origin of controversial data? So I don't know if it's actually true, or if it's just a rumor that people find data that they could not get on their own, illegally downloaded and on the dark web. So how are we as a field thinking about and dealing with found data, especially, you know, things that were potentially collected in ways that are not within our ethical frameworks?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would encourage people to go to 6, because that we often have a case study where we talk about an example of some of that kind of data. So if you'd like a chance to talk about that particular kind of thing with colleagues,
yes,
6 is a great place. I would say that there aren't clear standards yet. It seems to depend a lot on what the data is. To give some concrete examples, There was the leak of State Department cables. And so there are people who have written papers about those cables. There are privacy and security researchers in computer science who have looked at the Snowden documents. There's a debate about, there's this website called Ashley Madison, which is a dating website for people that are married.
Mhm.
They were hacked and a bunch of data was released. There have been debates about to what extent that should be used for research or not. I don't think there are very clear standards. And so I think in a case where you were thinking of working without clear standards, some of the ideas in chapter 6 could be helpful, and having a community that you can talk to about it could be helpful, and then writing about it in your paper. So one of the things I advocate for in chapter 6 is writing an ethical appendix. That is to say, just say like, this is what I thought about, this is what I did, this is why I did it. I think that, you know, there's a lot of reasonable things to do. Just because one person doesn't agree with what you did ethically doesn't mean it's wrong. Like, I think a lot of the debate about ethics gets really hot, and people are really worried about being called unethical, which is understandable. But I think we have to remember that there are some things that are clearly unethical, and there are other things that are more involve trade-offs that are in a grayer area. And as a field, I think we're going to make more progress if we actually debate and talk about those things in public than if we just like call people out in a very aggressive way. I think like, how do we solve complex statistical problems? It's like, you would never yell at me if I like used a certain kind of estimator that you didn't like.
I might.
Yeah, but like, you know, we would talk about it and debate it.
Yeah.
And like over time it would get better. And so I would love for our ethical debates to be more like our other scholarly debates. And I realize that there are certain issues where we need to have a kind of a different way of looking at the problem. But I also think there are really hard trade-offs and complicated issues here. And no one knows the right thing for some of these problems. And if we all kind of approached it with humility and assuming that other people have good intentions, which is not always true, but a lot of times it is true, then we could make more progress together.
So I have one more question for you on chapter 7, the future.
Sure.
Before we end with you sharing your path to the professoriate. So how you from your origin to where you are now. I think a lot of us would love to know. So chapter 7, the future. So my question, the last question is, how do we make sure that as computational social scientists and researchers, that when we take advantage of these opportunities, often confronting difficult, ambiguous ethical decisions, that's straight from your book, that we don't lose sight of the crowd? Specifically, how do we make sure we consider and protect BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities beyond just the protections that are afforded to our most vulnerable, things that are mentioned in the Belmont report? So I guess what I'm hoping is that you'll talk a little bit about participant-centered data collection.
I think I would love to hear your answer to this question too. I know this is something you think a lot about.
I'm not the one being interviewed. Nice try though. I see what you did there. It worked last time. Not going to work this time.
No, I really would. I mean, I would say that I would say a lot of the things that I've seen that to me seem a little inappropriate or not good, I think a lot of the time those have been really accidents. Like, not in the sense of people just haven't thought about it in a certain way. And so I think more thought about this dimension of the research process. That's why I tried to put ethics in all of the chapters. It's because it shouldn't be something you think of as separate. It should be something you think of as part of the design, because there are, you know, all in design, there's always trade-offs, right? Like, there's cost and speed and accuracy, and these are trade-offs that a lot of researchers are used to making. And I think in computational social science, increasingly, there's an ethical dimension to those trade-offs. And so as a field, I hope we can just build that more into how we think about our trade-offs. And the more that we talk about it and the more that we think about it, I think the better we'll get at doing it the right way. And so I hope that, I mean, this is one of the reasons why at the Summer Institute, we do ethics on the first day, because we think that sets a tone for the rest of people's time together. It's a very important part of the field. And I hope in the future, we think of it more as integrated into methods rather than something that's separate from how we do our research. There's research and then there's ethics. It's kind of like the police of the research. I think that kind of separated view can create things that are not so good. We kind of think of them as holistic things that are all part of, that we balance and decide as we do our work, and that we change over time as we learn more. The way we strike this balance can change.
All right, I'll answer the question also. Fine.
Thank you. Thank you.
So part of it builds on something you said early on in our discussion, where we can have these respectful conversations about statistical methods, but when we jump into ethics, that people are very entrenched, and it becomes kind of it becomes a question of intentions. And so I think part of it is just bringing ethics into the light. And I'm Naniette explaining what you just said. Bringing ethics into the light. I think it's also being very intentional with method sections about doing no harm, having a plan to think about, doing analysis and making sure that we're not including more people than we need to, and then also doing some sort of harm analysis. So really considering the potential for harm, and also not relying on just because once we get deep into the research, you have this I have this focus where I'm trying to get it to move forward, and you can miss the forest for the trees. So figuring out ways to interrogate that with people that might have a different perspective. So for me, a lot of this is representation too. So our IRBs have to include the people that we're studying on them, and also as we think about in a real way, making sure we're not doing harm to communities of color, making sure that when you look around the table at the people that are helping you with your work, that they represent a knowledge base that goes beyond just quantitative, qualitative, and content, that it thinks about the curated experiences of the people in your study, is what I would say too. All right, so Matt,
I agree with that. I love ethics, bringing ethics into the light. I love that expression.
Thank you. We can put that onto the too after.
Exactly.
End with your path to the professoriate. I can only imagine that it's as interesting bit by bit, sort of getting worked out at the coffee machine, which of course I always have my copy nearby. Here it is, bit by bit, right here.
Very nice.
Please tell us how you found your way to the professoriate, Matt.
Kind of by accident, I would say. Let's see. So, an undergraduate, I majored in math, and I like that. I like the cleanliness of it. It's very clean. But then towards the end of it, I started getting bored proving things about things that didn't exist. And then I thought, well, maybe I would go to. So I never really thought about becoming a professor. I did know that I liked being in school. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll go to grad school. But I thought maybe I would go to grad school in statistics, because that's kind of like combining math and the world. But then I wasn't really sure. And so I decided to work for a while as a statistician. And so I worked for 2 years at the Census Bureau on a project estimating the undercount in the 2000 census. And that was a great experience, but that convinced me I did not want to go to graduate school in statistics. Although now I realize what I was doing as a 22-year-old at the Census Bureau had very little to do with what I would do as a PhD student in statistics. I didn't realize that at the time. And so I wanted, move more into the social sciences, because there you can see more, it's still more, some statistics, but it's more engagement with the world. And then I picked sociology because it was really the most flexible. You can do almost anything you want as a sociologist. You can study almost anything in the world.
Yes, it's so true.
Almost any method in the world.
So true. Yes.
And this is in some ways a frustration of people in our field, I think, that we don't have a ton of knowledge accumulation and so on. But on the other hand, it is very good because it allows you a lot of freedom. As the problems of the world change, what we study can change, our methods can evolve, and so I ended up going to graduate school in sociology. I started at Cornell. I was there for 2 years, and then I decided I wanted to try to study abroad. So my brother studied abroad for a semester as an undergraduate, and I didn't when I was an undergraduate, and I realized that he had such a great experience. So I tried to study abroad for a year as a grad student, and I did. I was very lucky to be able to go to Holland for a year to study at the University of Groningen, which is a great place for people doing research at the intersection of networks and statistics. And in kind of, there's a lot of people there also doing like formal rational choice sociology, which I was interested in at the time. So I had this great experience in the Netherlands. And then during that, this is kind of a long story, I now realize it is. So during that time, I met Duncan Watts. Actually, when I started grad school, I met him because when I was at Cornell, I was in an interdisciplinary program. I was in the sociology department, but I was also in an interdisciplinary program in nonlinear dynamics, which was run by Steve Strogatz, who was Duncan's advisor, dissertation advisor. And so he said, "Oh, Matt, you're doing like mathematical sociology. You should meet Duncan." And I said, "Okay, yeah, that's cool." And so I met Duncan. We started working together, and then I really enjoyed working with him. And so I wanted to work with him on my dissertation. And so then I transferred to Columbia, and I did my dissertation at Columbia, and then I got my job at Princeton.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. I always find these origin stories for people so interesting. I didn't realize we overlapped in Western New York.
Yeah, I could say it. I could tell a story about how it all makes sense after the fact, but while I was going through it, it certainly didn't all feel like it made sense. It just.
And I think that point is so important that, you know, the
Mhm.
path to success is not a straight line. There's all sorts of stuff that happens in the middle. And I thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. And I know a lot of other people will too.
Yeah,
So
I just want to say one more thing about this story, that every one of those places, though, I feel really lucky that there were great opportunities that came up in those places. Yeah, everywhere there's the I really am each of those steps feels kind of strange, but at each of those places I learned some really important things that kind of make up my worldview as a researcher.
And things like SIX for me are definitely part of the establishment of my worldview as an academic. My confidence, just, you know, I've met so many amazing people and feel so fortunate to have you and Chris in my universe. And
Thank you.
yeah, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. So you'll note there is a resources slide on the screen, and on that slide you'll be able to see how to find your way to the SIX website, the 6 Howard Mathematica website, how to join the 6 Howard email list. You can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and also email us. We hope to see an application from you this year, our first year that 6 Howard Mathematica will be hosted at a historically Black university. If you're catching us in 2022 or to the future, we hope you'll apply. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.